So good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this program. My name is Stephen. I'm a member of the Ennismore Retreat Centre community here in Cork. And I've been invited to share with you some thoughts on meditating, especially meditating at this time of COVID-19. I'd like to begin perhaps by just outlining what I like to do in this short talk is to introduce a little bit into one particular teacher, a man called Evagrius, who was a 4th century monastic. And the reason I want to introduce him is because you will find that he's very current. Today people are talking about mindfulness and about living in the moment as if it was something that we discovered in the 20th century or 21st century. In actual fact, when you hear the words in a few moments of Evagrius, he was in the 4th century. And he was saying the very same thing as currently we're being taught in mindfulness courses. The only difference, one might say, is that for Evagrius, he was talking about meditation as a relationship with God, rather than meditation as a technique. So a relationship rather than a technique. So let's start. When people think about meditation, they probably think about somebody sitting quietly, having holy thoughts, everything being in harmony. But you and I know that's not the reality. The minute we sit in silence, our minds become hyperactive. So the image we know, or the reality we know, is not of quietness and solitude. Very often it's very active and turmoil going on inside our minds when we stop. And this man, Evagrius, I mentioned a few moments ago, he very simply says to us, our thoughts are simply thoughts. They're neutral. They're not good, they're not bad. What we say today is, he speaks about non-judgment. We simply have thoughts. But then his big insight is that we are bigger than our thoughts. And the mistake we perhaps make is that our thoughts control us, or we allow them to control us. He simply says, in a very gentle way, not forcing anything, thoughts come and go. And we know at the moment, neuroscientists tell us, that thoughts have a lifespan of about 90 seconds, unless we're Irish, or Italian, or Jewish. And then we hold on to them for 10 years, 40 years, our grandfather and our great-grandfather. You know what I'm saying? So Evagrius is saying, relax, relax. The warfare or the battle going on in the mind is something that actually you have control over. And I won't go into too much detail because there are several volumes about his theory of the 8 thoughts. Just to say one thing quickly, unfortunately, when the church got hold of Evagrius, they turned his 8 thoughts into the 7 deadly sins. Evagrius never spoke of sin. He actually was accused of being too soft, being too positive on human nature. He was somebody I'd have loved to have met, because there was something, yes, positive about him, yet quite realistic. So he would say things like, notice what it is that trigger your thoughts. To quote him verbatim, he says, notice the rise and the fall, the endurance, the things that make you cling onto your thoughts. If we know what they are, then in a sense, we have mastery then over our thoughts. So, moving on from Evagrius, and maybe moving into the heart of what I want to say in this little chat with you, is that there's no perfect place, no perfect time to meditate. There's no perfect state. We meditate as we are. We meditate in the state of mind and the state of being that we're in. And I'd like to look, because I'm coming from the Christian tradition, I'd like to look a little bit at meditation, specifically within the Christian tradition, but also I want to use some contemporary poets. Some of them you will know. In the Christian tradition, When the disciples were asked by Jesus, teach us to pray or teach us to meditate, it might surprise you to know he did not give them a method. He didn't say, do this or that. You know? He simply said, when you pray. When you pray. So one prays or one meditates by meditating. It's not something that's done outside of ourselves. It's not something that has a particular special method we must follow, and then it will deliver a sort of inner peace to us. We simply pray or meditate, and this can be done whatever state of mind we're in. Because there is a little heresy or a little mistake we make, I think, and actually I used to make it, namely that the feeling that one had to be in a positive state to meditate or to pray, that everything had to be in balance in one's life, it was calm and so forth. Catherine Sutton, who you will hear in another talk, I remember one evening she was running a mindfulness course here in Ennismore, and some people were talking outside the room, and I felt rather annoyed at them because I felt they were distracting the meditation that Catherine was leading in this very room. So after the session was over, I went over to her to apologize for the noise and the distraction. And I remember her words very well. She said, Stephen, there's no perfect place. There are no distractions. My students must learn to meditate sitting on a bus, in the middle of a crowded street, in the middle of noise. So let's forget about having the perfect place or the right place. One learns to meditate wherever one is. And in looking at that kind of comment of Catherine, made me think at the time, in the Christian tradition, you find people in all sort of messy situations, personal lives in a mess. And in the middle of this mess is where they feel the presence of God. Think of Jacob, stole from his father, stole his brother's birthright, was on the run. The family were out to kill him. A man on the run, no land, no family, no God, no name, nothing. And in this chaotic personal mess, we have the lines, I did not know that God was in this place. What was this place? It was personal chaos. The story also of Hannah in the Bible. Hannah was told she couldn't have a child. In the midst of that social deprivation, social mockery, being put down by others, being regarded as not being a real woman. In the middle of this personal tragedy as she saw it, she turns to prayer. And finally, Jesus himself. We find Jesus at prayer not only in so-called peaceful times, but in the midst of Gethsemane. His very last words given to us was a prayer for the cross. So there's no perfect place. There's no perfect way. We pray, as Jesus told us in that text I referred to, when you pray, pray. Throughout literature and poetry, one finds people who guide us and have the same teaching for us. And so when we think of people like Horace Thomas, the Welsh poet, or others, we find in them constant reference to living in moments that are difficult. Actually, Horace Thomas sums it up by saying that the presence of the holy, the presence of what is divine, the presence of what is sacred, its presence is in its absence. See, the second fault we have perhaps that we need to look at is that in meditating we tend to think we possess God, or we possess the sacred, or whatever you believe God to be. But that's my controlling the situation. Whereas in actual fact, all traditions, be it Buddhist, Christian, others, have the same message. Prayer, or meditation, or stillness is something which happens to us. We don't create it. We are called into it, into what one writer calls into the silent land. There is a need, there's a hunger, there's a seduction, There's a thirst, call it what you want. But we are the guests into the silence. When we think we've created it, then the ego takes over and we're focusing more on ourselves and on method and style and performance. But if we come to that state of meditation or prayer, call it what you will, as we are, then that's the reality of it. We come with our real selves, not pious, silly nonsense, not Holy Mary, make me up holy nonsense. We come broken, tired, exhausted, angry. That's the state in which meditation happens. So, as I've said on a few occasions, and you'll hear it again, there's no special place, no special way. And as soon as we know that, I think that frees us up a bit. We're now in the middle of a pandemic. We're now in what one writer called a time of forced reflection. I was reading an article recently in The Guardian, and the writer, a man called Bruno Latour, a French philosopher, made this one-line comment, and it kind of jumped out at me. He wrote, "The lockdown forced everyone into a kind of retreat, a moment for reflection." The word that jumped out to me was the word forced. You see, you and I can choose a time to be quiet. We can go for a walk by the River Lee, or we can go down to Garryvoe, or we can go for a walk in a forest, or we can read a book, or we can be silent in our own home or apartment. These will be choices we make. We choose our reflection. We choose the time. The mood takes us over. But now we're in a forced situation. We haven't chosen this time. We haven't chosen the isolation. We haven't chosen the fact that we can't socialize. It is, as Latour said, it is a forced time, a forced reflection, forced upon us. And I came across a poem recently by a man called Edward Stafford. The poem is called The Way It Is. And in it, Stafford is addressing what is it that holds us, what centers us at such times. I quote 3 lines in the poem. "There's a thread to follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread." Now that sounds very nice, very wow, very hippie-ish, oh, wow. But we know the reality is we do let go of the thread. I have let go of the thread in these weeks and these months. Some days I'm not sure what day it is. Some days I have no clue what's happening around me. Seconds seem very long, and days can fly by. It's a very strange reality. But like Evagrius said earlier, and now what we're hearing in this poem by Stafford, unless we are held, unless we are present, unless we are focused, unless we are centered, then we are pillared around like the leaves on this December morning. We're pillared here, there, and everywhere. So what do we do? What do we do now? What do I do? What do you do? How do we meditate in this moment? Before answering the question, I'd like to give you an image from the Zen tradition. And the image is very simple, and it's one worth holding on to. The image is of a mountain, and all around the mountain, a wild tornado has erupted. And if you think of the image for a moment, a tornado can move houses, can destroy cars, can destroy lives. Chaotic. Chaos swirling at the foot of the mountain. But the mountain is static. The mountain doesn't change. The mountain doesn't move. So the image being that the turbulence and all that's going on inside of us and outside of us does not necessarily have to disturb us. And the method that we're going to present this morning is looking at that. How do we remain undisturbed? It would be foolish to think that we are totally undisturbed. Of course we're touched by COVID-19. Of course we're touched by isolation. Of course we're touched by the fact that we can't hug somebody or hold somebody, or the fact we can't visit somebody. People relating through glass windows in nursing homes. Of course we're touched by that. But there's something that holds us in the middle of this. And ironically, what holds us really is a word that might surprise you, that I would even use it, but there's actually a staying in the darkness of that is what holds us. Staying in the darkness. Darkness is seen as a negative thing. Darkness is seen as something menacing. We even use the word in imagery to describe a negative thing. But when we look at traditions within Buddhism, Christianity, within Islam, within literature, within poetry, you will see actually that darkness is a source of light. One mystic said in a moment of joy, "O dazzling darkness, O bright solitude." It's funny, isn't it, that we see the stars in the night when the night is dark. We cannot see stars in the city sky. We see light in darkness. And in the Christian tradition, St. John in particular speaks a lot about this, that the light came in the darkness, not outside it, not denying darkness, not denying messiness, not denying confusion, but light in the darkness. In a poem called A Coincidence of Opposites, Bonnie Thurston writes, here she's asking questions of darkness. Is it empty or populated? If populated, by what? Perhaps by beauty not ready to be revealed. Suppose denizens of darkness are a coincidence of opposites, that the beautiful and the hideous are cosmically necessary, their tensive existence life-giving yin and yang, the lovely and the leprous, the treasure hidden in darkness, the treasure hidden in darkness. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, in particular in the writings of the prophet Isaiah, we find this image again. Isaiah once wrote, spoke about riches hidden in secret places. Riches hidden in secret places. As we said earlier, St. John speaks about light shining in the darkness. Peter speaks about a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises. So throughout many traditions, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, others, there's this constant holding in tension of light and darkness. And in particular, in our Celtic tradition, we have it. The dance of light and darkness, the dance of the solstice. And it is saying the same thing to us as the Judeo-Christian scriptures are saying, that light and darkness can be held together in balance. We don't have to deny darkness. We don't have to deny anything that we call negative. It actually has a potential to feed us and to support us. When one mentions darkness and a time of darkness, at least in the Christian tradition, one name crops up. The name of John of the Cross, Juan de la Croce, the Spaniard. I'm going to quote for you 3 or 4 lines of a poem of his. And when you hear the lines, you'll think, my God, this was written in a beautiful, calm, serene background. But the opposite is true. The opposite is quite true. John was a broken, battered man. He He was bullied by his fellow monks, Carmelite monks. They imprisoned him, they starved him, they deprived him of light and of food. John was a dreamer. John was a reformer. And he wanted to reform the order of Carmel, go back to the basic life, the gospel message. But to people, to others, he was a threat, he and Teresa of Avila. And so when he wrote these lines, they were written from a place of pain. O guiding night, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. I repeat, O guiding night, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. So these words of John came, as we said, not from peace and calm, not from a sense of everything being, wow, perfect. He was a broken man, psychologically battered. And from that context, these words came. So when we said earlier, one can meditate or prayer anywhere, think of John of the Cross. Think of John and read his poetry, read the Canticle, or read the Dark Night. They're very short, a few pages. But they've come from a place not of calm, not of having everything, as we say, together. They came from a man who was fighting with his demons and fighting with people around him. Today we'd say he was a victim of bullying, surprisingly, bullying by fellow priests and brothers. Yeah? Moving on from John of the Cross, the Welsh poet Fr Thomas, a lot of his poems concern this question of living in darkness, living in a sense of having an absence, living with a thirst, living with a desire that seems never to be met. In one of his poems, Via Negativa, he wrote, "The darkness is the deepening shadow of your presence, the silence a process of the being of love. The darkness is the deepening shadow of your presence." You might say that sounds like a paradox or a contradiction. Darkness and presence. Darkness, normally we think of absence. But for Fr Thomas's poetry and literature, but mainly his poetry, it's a constant theme of his. He's a man well worth reading. That we don't need to possess to, in a sense, to be at peace. He would say to possess even a feeling of prayer, a feeling of meditating, is it defeat? Is the ego speaking? Because as I said earlier, if meditation and prayer is something we're invited into, then it's not something we own. It's not something we create. So whether it is within the mindfulness tradition, very current now, or within the Judeo-Christian tradition, or Islam or Buddhism, you find the same message over and over again. We are the guests of meditation. We are the guests of prayer. I'm reminded now, as I'm thinking of Iris Murdoch's definition of prayer in her book, The Sovereignty of the Good, where she says prayer is no more than paying attention to what God is doing in us. Prayer or meditation is no more than paying attention to what God is doing within us. Whether you're a believer in God or not is not an issue here. The experience can be yours whether you're a believer in God or not. Paying attention to whatever is at work within you, what calls you into silence, what calls you into being still. That's at the heart of all traditions, Christian, Judaic, and others, and even beyond formal religion. It is almost our DNA, as if we're almost built for some level of silence, some level of reflection, some level of slowing down. It is, in fact, in our DNA. And in a very gentle poem by Jane Kenyon, the poem with the lovely title, Let the Evening Come, she, like Evagrius, introduces this theme of slowing down. I quote, "Let the evening come. Let it come as it will. And don't be afraid. God does not leave us comfortless. So let the evening come." The evening has the image of the darkness, especially in this month of December now, the first day of December. But what she and others I've quoted are saying is, don't be afraid of that. Step into it. As she says, let the evening come. I mentioned Bonnie Thurston earlier, and I'd like to, in coming to a close here, to give you a quote from her writings where she asks us to change our perspective on darkness or negativity. She changes it to a very positive potential for good. She writes, "What would change if we shifted our expectations about darkness? What if we allowed the possibility that it contained revelation, a gift, God, new life? Suppose instead of unremitting suffering and evil, a source of radiance or healing was present there. Suppose darkness were a process containing a presence, offering a promise. Certainly that would comfort the desperately ill, the sufferers from emotional darkness and depression, and those who carry in their hearts humanity's hurts, those vicarious sufferers who became our saints." So Thurston is asking us to look at what we normally associate as a negative thing in a positive light, that everything has potential, everything has a possibility. So in drawing this reflection to a close, the purpose, what I've been trying to do in these few moments with you, is to perhaps invite you into meditation as you are. Not as you would like to be, not as you should be, not as you feel you must be, but as you are. And part of that is simply just stopping. You will have the method already about breathing and so forth, focusing on the breath. I'll leave that to others to speak about. But it's simply to stop, and stop as you are. Because very often we meditate believing that we can only receive the fruits of meditation, as I said earlier, when we're in a positive state. But we know that's not true. And I'd like to end this reflection with a few lines from a book which I would recommend, a book entitled Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird. And I'll leave the final words to him. "The doorway into the silent land is a wound. Silence lays bare this wound. We do not journey far along the spiritual path before we get some sense of the wound of the human condition. And this is precisely why not a few abandon a contemplative practice like meditation as soon as it begins to expose this wound. They move on to some spiritual entertainment that will maintain distraction. Perhaps this is why the weak and the wounded, who know very well the vulnerability of the human condition, often have an aptitude for discovering silence and can sense the wholeness and the healing that ground in this wound. There is something seductive about the contemplative path. I'm going to seduce her and lead her into the desert and speak to her heart, wrote the prophet Hosea. It is tempting to think of this as being a superior path. More often, however, the seduction is to think that we can use our practice of contemplation as a way to avoid facing our woundedness. If we can just go deeply enough into contemplation, we won't struggle any longer. It is common enough to find people taking a cosmetic view of contemplation, and then, after considerable time and dedication to contemplative practice, discover that they still have the same old warts and the same old struggles they hoped contemplation would remove or hide. They think that somewhere they must have gone wrong. Certainly, there is a deep conversion, a deep healing, and unspeakable wholeness to be discovered along the path. The paradox, however, is that this healing is revealed when we discover that our wound and the wound of God are the one wound.